Hey everybody, welcome back to Raise Game Fully. My name is Jim. Today I'll be making another video in my series on the Dungeons & Dragons game world of Mystara. In particular, I've been talking about a series of game supplements called Gazetteers, which help flesh out and describe the various nations of the campaign setting. Today I will be talking about Gazetteer 9, the Minrothad Guilds, by Deborah Christian and Kim Eastland. Now, you might be asking yourself, your last video was about Gazetteer 1, why is this video about Gazetteer 9? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the numbering on the Gazetteers was more of a cataloging device. They're not sequential, they don't need to be played in a particular order. And in fact, they shouldn't be. If your party happens to explore a certain area of the game world, it's perfectly acceptable to just use that gazetteer to describe the geography, the political situation, and the NPCs that they find in that area. The second reason I'm using Gazetteer 9 today, it has to do with the geography of the world and the way the expert rulebook presented it. The creators of basic D&D assume that low-level characters are going to start their adventures in the Grand Duchy of Karamikos, which I talked about in my last video. Upon reaching 4th level, they graduate to the expert rules. And in the expert rulebook boxed set, there was an introductory adventure to expert level gaming called the Isle of Dread. Now, in the adventure, the party finds a ship's log and a treasure map, and they have to sail across the ocean to discover this mysterious island and discover monsters and treasures that might exist there. Anybody who is taking a ship from Karamikos and sailing out into the Southern Sea is going to leave and head directly into the islands of Minrothad, as I'm showing on this map here. And very, very early on when I ran the Isle of Dread, we didn't know anything about Minrothad. It was kind of just a blank area on the map. And we just used it as a resting point and a stopping off point to head off to the Isle. But in fact, Minrothad is an amazing culture. It's an amazing nation. So it made a lot of sense for me to talk about that one next. Let me give you just a sense of what Minrothad is all about before I start dissecting the Gazetteer. And there's a lot to dissect. There's a lot of great material in this. As usual with any type of D&D product, feel free to use as much or as little as you want, but there is a lot of great information in this Gazetteer. Okay, so Minrothad is very, very different from Karamikos. Karamikos definitely had a flavor of a 9th or 10th century medieval European kingdom with a lot of emphasis on knights and clerics. Minrothad is much more like the Caribbean in the 16th century. And there's a heavy emphasis on merchants, rogues, demi-humans, and sea captains who can use ocean magic. Minrothad is a chain of islands. I think there's about 6. And historically what has happened there is each of the races from Dungeons & Dragons had settled on one of the islands. So there is an island where the elves live, there's an island where the humans live, an island where the dwarfs live, and an island where the halflings live. And over the centuries, these races, since they produce 4 or 5 commodities, created a trade network. And the leaders of the clans and the masters of the clans kind of profited heavily from this trade network. And this network of merchants became powerful enough to create a system of government to run the islands. And since everything was broken into products and workmanship, and since everybody belonged to a guild for protection and for fairness, This guild-type government evolved where the 5 or 6 clan leaders created sort of a government by council. It's reminiscent of a modern-day governor with an executive council. It also has, I always felt that it had a flavor of like the 5 families from the Godfather series. One race that's very prominent in Minrothad are water elves. And if you're familiar with AD&D, or if you're familiar with later editions of D&D, I'm not sure if there's a water elf equivalent. I'm familiar with the sea elves from Kryn, but they're more aquatic. They're more akin to Nixies. But the water elves of Minrothad are basically wood elves, forest elves, that have just fallen in love with the sea. And they have built their livelihood around living in the sea and sea magic. Okay, so this is a general sense of what Minrothad is all about. Let me get into the product itself. This, of course, is the cover of the Gazetteer with an amazing artwork by Clyde Caldwell. The inside of the cover has several maps. This one here is a town, kind of a secret city called Cove Harbor. This is a map of the principal city of the Water Elves called Seaholm. And it's difficult to tell in this map, but the white areas on the left are actually inside a cave, and the darker areas to the right are exposed above ground. So the entire city is built in a grotto, which is super cool. There's a great picture I can show you guys later on of Seaholm. Here's another map of the city of Gapton. It's a small scholarly community built in a crevice of a mountain range. And then, of course, if you remember from my last video where I described the basic setup of Gazetteers, there was a large paper fold-out map that came with the Gazetteer. One side of the map was a map of Minrothad. And here you can see the principal islands. The pink areas on the map are semi-permanent fog banks that are somewhat magical in nature, and they play a big role in keeping foreigners away from the Isles. Because of these fog banks, and because of the kind of reputation of the sea itself, many mariners from the mainland really don't venture far away from land. I know the map is really small, but there are dotted lines that show the common trade paths. Karamikos is on the top left, Thyatis is on the top right, and most of the trade routes hug the coastline. And it's really only the Minrothadans who are adept at sailing these waters. Because of the shipbuilding of the Water Elves, Minrothad has really become an international presence. They maintain strict neutrality with all the other nations of the world, and they have developed a virtual trade empire across the world. Their ships are probably the best in Mystara, and with their combined shipbuilding and sea magic, they can manipulate the fog banks, they can manipulate the shoals, and they can get in and out of the Isles a lot easier than foreigners can. On the bottom of the large fold-out map, there were some ship designs, which I thought was a really cool touch. This here is what they call a Minroth Clipper. It's a typical water elf ship design. It's very sleek. The humans of the Isle have developed a different style of ship. This is called the Harbortown Trader, and you can see it's much larger. Other areas of the large fold-out map contain town maps or city maps in the nature that I explained in the Gazetteer on Karamikos. It's a similar style. This is the city of Harbortown, which is one of the 2 human cities in the Isles. One thing that I always thought was amusing about this is if you notice on the map, the left part of the city, virtually half of the city, is given up to the residents of the clan master and the guild master. So you can really see the discrepancies between the rich and the poor in Minrothad, whereas the rich basically literally control and run half of the city, and everybody else is squeezed into the other part of the city. This is a map of the city of Minrothad, which is the capital city of the guilds of the Isles. And again, too, here you can see the palace of the ruling guildmaster virtually takes up a third of the city. Minrothad is not a coastal town. It's situated in this little lake, which is on a river that feeds into the ocean. But there's a great diagram I will show you later on where you can see how there's an underground harbor. The gate on the bottom of this map here opens up, and underneath the city there's a underground harbor, and goods and people are transported to the city proper by a series of elevators and pulleys, which is very, very cool. The large fold-out map also showed a diagram of Stronghold, which is the primary dwarven city and fortress of the Isles. And it has some really, really cool diagrams here for defensive measures. The dwarves have there's a long channel that leads from Stronghold out to the ocean, and it's got some examples here of defensive measures that the dwarves have put in place to discourage attacks. Okay, so let's get into the booklet itself. With Minrothad, there were two separate booklets. There was a player's booklet and a dungeon master's booklet. I'll start talking about the player's booklet first. This copy here, it didn't come out blue, which is such a crime. Here's my paper copy. The fact that it's blue just gives it overall a great vibe to the whole product. Really makes you feel like you're in the island community with the color of sea. The first part of the player's guide is really cleverly done because it welcomes you to Minrothad with some conversations from people that you might meet elsewhere. The Gazetteer assumes that you're not creating Minrothadan characters right away. It assumes that you are travelers or foreigners or visitors. So it gives a couple of examples of what other visitors from other lands would say to you if you came to Minrothad, which was really, really nice. It kind of gave you an opinion about the Isles, and maybe not necessarily accurate opinions, but it kind of set the tone for everybody has an opinion on Minrothad one way or the other, whether they love it or hate it. So I thought that was really, really clever. This continues here with a short history as told by the Water Elves. It's basically the story that I told you earlier about how the different races came to the Isles at different times. They set up a trade network. Over time, those guilds and those families created a ruling council, which is the system of government in Minrothad as of this day. There's a short section here on economy. This doesn't have a whole lot to do with players, especially if they're visiting from other parts of Mystara. If you get to the point where you want to create Minrothadan characters, it's a nice little background and summary of how important trade and money is to the Minrothadans. So I thought that was a nice touch. With so much money and trade moving into and out of the Isles, there's a lot of crime. There's a lot of thieves, there's a lot of pirates, and this is a section here in the player's guide that talks about law, how laws are enforced, what some typical crimes and punishments are. This is a little small here, so sorry if the print is hard to read. But it was neat that they came up with a system of crimes and punishments just to let the players know ahead of time what is in store for them if they are looking to break the rules, or what could happen to the thieves if they get caught here in Minrothad. The next section talks about society, and there's a lot of interaction between the races in Minrothad. It's really kind of a melting pot. Even though the races tend to stay on their own islands as far as homes are concerned, the races mix pretty freely. On any given ship crew, you'll see different races. You'll see elves, dwarves, and humans and halflings mixed together. So it addresses that here in the society section. Just to point out a couple things on this page, language, they established that it is an offshoot of the Phaeacian language, but it is so heavily mixed with slang and accents and dialects that it's really evolved into its own language. The example that comes to mind is English from America or England in comparison to the dialect of English that's spoken in Jamaica, for example. So they talk about that here. You can give your Minrothadian characters a distinct flavor if you could incorporate that into your characters. And there's examples of it, as I mentioned, as the gazetteer is presented. It presents it in a way where locals and foreigners are talking about Minrothad, and you kind of do get a flavor of that patois accent here. It talks about names, dress, basically anything's on the table as far as dress is concerned, because styles are imported from all over the known world, as are dietary habits. This is a little section on tips to travelers, and again, it is presented, they give you 6 examples of what people from other parts of the world are saying about Minrothad. There's a lot of misconceptions about the place. There's a lot of rumors and mystique and fear about the sailors and the merchants from Minrothad, and they really present it very, very well here. There's a short section on the beliefs of Minrothad. Clerics are not terribly popular here. The Minrothadans don't really enjoy people telling them how to behave or what they should be observing as far as rituals. Money, magic, sea power is key. It's the king in Minrothad. You can do whatever you want as long as you have those things, and religion really, really takes a back seat in Minrothad. The gazetteer does talk about certain religions, and it's much more modern in its approach than some of the other gazetteers. Some gazetteers take a more medieval approach to religion, such as Karamikos. Some of the gazetteers take a more pagan view of religion, which I'll get into in further videos. Minrothad takes the approach that there are organized religions, there are priests who preach those religions, they're not clerics, they don't go on adventures very regularly. If you wish to play a cleric, by all means, but the religions are more of things that the citizens just honor. They'll make a little sacrifice before they take to the sea, or they'll observe a holy day here and there, or they won't drink on a certain day of the week. So there's some more, the religion in Minrothad is present. It's just a little bit different from other aspects of D&D, which are very, very familiar, which are more focused on clerical magic and things of that nature. Here is the calendar. This is based on the Phaeacian calendar, which I mentioned in my video on Karamikos. So that's super cool. They've got phases of the moon, I believe, and they've got holy days listed here in response to, or to add to the section on religion that we just saw. Now, there's a large section of the player's guide that deals with races. This is really cool if you're looking to make a character from Minrothad. Obviously, if you're visiting, there's not a whole lot you have to worry about. A human is a human, an elf is an elf. A dwarf, halflings are pretty standard across all the nations of Mystara. This section here gives specific information if you are looking to create a Minrothadian character. And one of the things it does is it builds upon the skills system that I talked about in the video on Karamikos. Skills were a relatively new idea to the game back in the early 80s. It wasn't part of the initial design, but it really gave everybody an option to customize and individualize their characters. And here, having created a Minrothadian character, you have sets of skills that weren't available to mainland characters, such as combat rigging. It gave you a bonus to fight from the rigging of ships, certain types of long sight or artillery to load arrows and shot into seaborne combat, because don't forget there's no gunpowder, so ship combat was done with ballistas and catapults. There's all kinds of skills as far as crafting goes, with such an emphasis on guilds and trades and manufacture. you kind of have to have a job in Minrothad. You have to be good at something, whether it's metal crafting as a dwarf, whether it's shipbuilding as a water elf, or whether it's farming or dealing in magic as a human. All of the races have specific trades and skills that is their specialty. The wood elves, just to go off of this page here, the wood elves specialize in wood crafting. They specialize in furniture making, making bows, anything to do with plants. The water elves, of course, are masters of shipbuilding. They know how to make sails and ships and sail the ocean, water magic. The humans have specialized in food production, magic production, potions, things of that nature. The halflings specialize in leatherworking. That's their specialty. This page that I've put up here is a little bit of a flow chart of the government. And you can see, well, if you can read it, at the top of the page, it lists the heads of the 5 family guilds. These are the guilds that run each race, and how they are related to the ruling guild master, which is someone who is elected to run the country, and the various guilds that are subject to the ruling guild master. It's very much like a cabinet, and how all these guilds are under his direct control. The family guilds are what you're born into. If you are a halfling, you take up the job that your family does. You are a leather worker. If you are a wood elf, you are born into carpentry. You make furniture and bows. So you can either join the family guild, or you can leave that life behind and join one of the various tutorial guilds, where you apprentice to somebody, learn their art, become a journeyman, eventually become a master. And these are a lot more service-oriented instead of product-oriented guilds. But anyway, the Gazetteer goes into amazing depth into all of these guilds and just lays it out perfectly in the player's guide to give you a sense of just what is involved in being a Minrothadan and how important it is to have a trade and to progress the ranks through that guild that you're in. This is a great page too. This shows some of the standards and some of the devices used to represent the various guilds. The guilds are named after leading families within each race. So for example, the middle top is Guild Hammer. Guild Hammer is obviously the dwarves. Guild Verdier is the wood elves. Guild Courser is the humans. Guild Quickhand is the halflings. Guild Elson are the water elves. There's also a section in the back of the player's book that talks about guild privileges. How do you get a deal? I mean, if you buy from your own guild, what kind of discount do you get? If you are cooperating with another guild on a certain project or a certain mission, do you get kickbacks? Do you get discounts? There's a very, very complicated system if you want to use it to have this interaction between all the guildsmen, which I thought was really, really cool. The sidebar here is a very, very quick glance into a specialized character that only exists in Minrothad called the Merchant Princes. And I'll get more into that when I talk about Merchant Princes in the Dungeon Master's book. But this was cool here because it gives you a little hint, a little snapshot at what Merchant Princes are, and it gives that to you in the form of a story about somebody who sees a merchant prince walking down the dock and they have to run off to talk to them about how important and how powerful they are, which I thought was a great, great way to present that. Okay, so that was the player's guide. I'm going to now talk a little bit about the Dungeon Master's book. Dungeon Master's book starts with an introduction, talks about the Isles in a way that I've already explained to you. There is a historical timeline. I had mentioned in my last video about how the Gazetteers tend to, in addition to using a common calendar, they tend to present a historical timeline in all of their books, which is really, really cool. It kind of brings all of the nations together, makes you feel like you're in the same game world, offers some continuity. But here's the timeline for Minrothad. One really, really important thing that happened recently in Minrothad history, where there is a huge lycanthropy outbreak, and some of the adventure hooks and stories later on still play upon that fear that there might be a weird creature lurking about somewhere. There's a large section on government. It describes the relationship between the family guilds and the ruling guildmaster's cabinet, how they all work together to create this society of mercantile trade in the Isles. There's a section here on intrigue. There is actually a really cool part of Minrothad whereby there was a disgraced water elf clan who was removed from power, and now they hate the ruling guildmaster. They've tried to assassinate him a couple times. That's a really, really cool adventure hook that you can play upon too. This section here talks about crime. It goes into some detail about thieves, how thieves operate, and the punishments. Very, very similar to the crime and punishment section from the player's book. But what is really interesting about this is it kind of imparts upon, well, it kind of tells you that one of the secrets about Minrothad is that many of the thieves and pirates that make Minrothad famous actually work for the government. There's actually a secret society of thieves called the Blue Eels that wander around the continent or wander around Minrothad. They do assassinations, they do high-end thief jobs, arson, make people look bad. The pirates as well are actually a division of the government called privateers. This, of course, refers to actual historical events whereby the English crown would authorize pirates to prey upon Spanish ships, for example. They would give them letters of marque, and which would legally allow them, quote unquote legally, would allow them to attack Spanish ships. So in Minrothad, there are actually privateers that are part of the government, which is kind of a closely guarded secret. You'd have to get into the right guilds to actually learn that. But the pirates are fairly common in the Isles. They will not attack Minrothad ships. They're only there as sort of a defense to prevent incursions from foreign powers. They're there to just sack enemy merchant vessels when the time is right for them. They don't want to discourage merchants from coming into and out of the Isles, but they want to maintain their monopoly on, well, Minrothad wants to maintain its monopoly on global trade. So the pirates are there just to kind of make sure that foreign merchants aren't getting too rich or too powerful. The pirate section goes into great detail about sea combat, which I thought was a great system. Ship combat was never really addressed in the rulebooks too well. So this section of the Gazetteer talks about ship combat. It talks about refereeing pirate encounters. The next section goes into the merchant princes, which I talked about a little bit before. It talks about who merchant princes are, what they're all about, and most importantly, it talks about how characters can become merchant princes. It's kind of an offshoot class. You have to attain, there is some prerequisites. You have to attain certain talent or skill in being a ship captain first. You have to be a certain level adventurer to apply. But once you do, and if you're so inclined, you can be welcomed into the clan, so to speak, of merchant princes. There's actually an experience point table that allows you to level up. There are spells that the water elves teach to the merchant princes. There are specific water wind magic spells that enable them to move around the sea more freely and enables them to dispel storms. It's a really cool class. I actually tried this once. In the process of playtesting, I was kind of solo adventuring as a merchant prince one time, and it was really cool. There was a lot of bookkeeping involved. You had to keep track of a lot of trade figures, and it felt a lot like math homework. But it's actually a really cool class, and I don't think anything really drives home the flavor of Minrothad quite as well as a merchant prince. Even if they're NPCs, I think it really encapsulates what Minrothad is about. There's a rather extensive section in the book on trade, not surprisingly, but it talks about different types of trade. Basic trade used buy a load of sugar here, you sail somewhere else and you sell it. There are also things called consignment trade and transport for hire. You can rent out your ship. It talks about ways to move up in the guilds, whether you're in the Merchant Sailors Guild or whether you're in the Merchant Prince Guild. And I love this section because the creators put so much effort into describing trade. It lists different types of ships that are commonly used in trade, some of their combat statistics. It talks about the process and the costs involved in ship construction. There's a little sidebar there about the Minrothad Navy. There's a large section on speculative trade. And this was super, super fun. What speculative trade is just the ongoing system of buying low, selling high, traveling across the continent and making profits. And it's not quite as simple as that. There's a lot to it, obviously. This section talks about how much each the types of ships, how much cargo they can hold, how much food they can hold for the crew, how you would hire a crew, how you would sail across the continent. And it actually lists the port cities of the continent here. It assigns a port class to it based on how deep the water is or how big the port is. And it talks about what things are in demand and what things are not in demand, which allows the merchants to buy low and sell high. And actually on the back of the big fold-out paper map I mentioned earlier that came with the Gazetteer, there was a second map that showed the major trade cities of the continent, the coastal ones anyway, and it talked about which goods would sell for more than market value and which goods would sell for less than market value. I believe the black items sell for less than market value and the red items sell higher than market value. And of course, this is for the Dungeon Master. You wouldn't just hand this to the players, but this is something that the players should discover over time. And they would learn that if I return to such and such a port, I can buy furs, I can sail to another port and sell those furs and make a handsome profit. And while I'm there, I can pick up armor and sell it somewhere else. So there's this whole system of speculative trade that can basically sustain a merchant character. I mean, it will give you tons of experience points. It will give you tons of side hooks if you run into storms or monsters. Your ship springs a leak, a mast breaks. You run into foreign pirates. You run into foreign navies. It really gives a foundation for a merchant class to really become its own character. And then, of course, as you're sailing around the world to different ports, you definitely have the chance for more traditional types of adventures, whether you're in port or at sea. So the whole trade system and the way it becomes a foundation for the merchant class in the Gazetteer, I thought was brilliant. I thought it was really, really clever and well done. And to complement this, there's a section in the Gazetteer on sailing, the rules of sailing, how to deal with weather effects, how to deal with getting lost. One of the skills that your crew should have is a navigation skill. Anybody who encounters things like fog or rain, or if the ship is becalmed, they have to make navigation checks. They may think they're going north, but in fact they're going northwest. So the section on sailing really presents all that in a very thorough and excellent way. This part of the sailing section also shows the shipboard chain of command, starting with the captain and the first mate and the officers all the way down to the crew, which I thought was neat. It actually talked about paying the crew too, like the first mate would get X number of shares and the quartermaster would get X number of shares on any job or if they found any treasure, which was really, really neat too. If you weren't too familiar with anything to do with naval history, it just presented it in such a really, really game-friendly way. The next section talked about demi-human crafts. In the companion rulebook, which of course was a sequel to the expert rulebook, the creators of D&D introduced the concept of demi-human clan crafts and how they have secret rituals that they can do. They can make things. And in this section here, it talks about the secret crafts of the Minrothad and water elves. They've got this hidden pearl somewhere, and they can chip pieces off of it, and they can make magical boats from it, magical items. The drawing here is actually a picture of the grotto that I talked about earlier. This is the exterior of the grotto. This is the interior of the grotto. So the city of Seahome, which is the home of the water elves, is built in this large limestone cave, which is super, super cool. It also talks about the secrets of the wood elves. The wood elves have this mystical tree that this keeper, who's a cleric type character, tends to. He can extract items from it and make oils and potions, which is pretty cool. This here is the section that continues to talk about the various towns and cities across the Isles, which I won't get into too much. I won't get into the details of each specific city. This is a drawing of the city of Minrothad, which I talked about earlier. You can see the city in the foreground. The ruling guildmaster's hall takes up a good chunk of the city. The Hammerspan, which is the small fortification across the bridge, is in the background. And you can see the gate that I talked about earlier. You can see the ships sailing into the gate. The next page actually showed, it was the previous page actually, showed the underground harbor underneath the city of Minrothad with docks and elevator and pulley systems for going up to the city, which was really, really cool. The next section delved into the personalities, but I thought it was neat to show you the city of Malfton, which is the halfling city. It's built across two hills, very similar to any halfling city elsewhere on Mystara. The easiest way I can describe it to you is it's Hobbiton from The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. And the personalities that are mentioned here are a mix of ruling guildmasters, heads of the families, heads of the family guilds, but it also introduces just some low-level characters that you might meet if you're out on a pub crawl or if you're just waiting in between adventures. And the last section of the Gazetteer are adventure hooks. They have just a few adventures. I think there's 2 or 3 for basic level characters, 2 or 3 for expert, etc., all the way up. There's only a handful. It definitely feels like Minrothad is a place that you would visit. It definitely feels like it's a place that you would leave and come back to. It's not. It certainly can be the seat of a campaign, especially if it was a city-based campaign. But the adventures are more short-term adventures, which is great. I mean, it's great to have short adventures that you can maybe knock out in a few hours. And that is it. That is the end of the Gazetteer. I hope you enjoyed it. It's definitely one of my favorite Gazetteers. I really appreciated all of the time and effort that the authors put into it, especially into the system of trade, the expansion of the skills, the new character class of the Merchant Prince. I thought it was all amazing. I thought it was all well done. Hopefully, if you're running a Mystara campaign, you can use this in your Mystara campaign and kind of paint in that blank area on the map that I talked to earlier. If you're not using a Mystara campaign, maybe there are islands in your campaign that you can use this material with. There's certainly a lot of great material in there. It's adaptable to any world, really. It doesn't have to be Mystara. But I hope that you enjoyed it. That is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be making another video in the coming weeks. Please check that out. And until then, please be kind to your fellow players.